Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about William Morris's News from Nowhere, which is a novel that I think a lot of contemporary readers, and probably even a lot of late Victorian readers, have a bit of an issue with, because it's not what we tend to expect in a novel. There's not that much plot, there's not that much psychological development of the characters. It's, in a way, it's more like a medieval sort of dream narrative, where a character sort of goes on an imagined or mystical journey and they observe stuff without necessarily doing all that much. So the novel follows this socialist, late Victorian socialist in London who falls asleep and wakes up several hundred years in the future to find that Britain has been transformed into a socialist paradise. And this is Morris's sort of aspiration for the future, because Morris himself was a socialist. So this is an agrarian paradise where the people are happy, they're healthy, they're physically beautiful, they live much longer than people in the Victorian era, and much healthier than people in the Victorian era. They only produce things that they need. They don't waste materials. They don't depend on industry, and they work because they genuinely enjoy working and find it rewarding. So one of the big things that News from Nowhere does is explores how this might be possible. So in that way, it's sort of more, in many ways, it's more a manifesto than a proper novel, the way that we tend to think of a novel. I mean, this is not, say, Dickens or Jane Austen or someone like this who writes more conventional, sort of narrative-based novels. This is very much a philosophical exploration of what an ideal agrarian socialist future could look like. So this Victorian socialist, who tells them to just call him Guest, so we have Guest as our narrator, basically he sort of meets up with some people and they're like, "Howdy, stranger. You look really odd in your 19th century clothes, as opposed to our sort of medieval style finery." And so this character, Dick, who becomes Guest's sort of host, takes him up to meet an old man who lives in a museum. And basically Guest and this old man talk for the first more than half of the novel, and the primary focus is, here's the history of how things have come to be, and here's how our society is organized. So we learn things about their gender relations, we learn things about how they produce, we learn things about their trade, we learn things about their, say, government, but really it's lack of government, because there's a sort of anarcho-socialism here. We learn about the ethics of communalism, the ethics of sharing resources. We learn about the sort of joy that they take in doing work, and the fact that they can take joy in doing work because it's not compelled. It's something that they do because they find joy in choosing the labor that they want to do. So no one is compelled to do any particular labor, but because labor has ceased to be something that one does, that's extracted from one, because labor is no longer tied to whether or not you can live, people are able to work out of the joy of doing productive things. And actually, interestingly enough, I think coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown has shown us that this is not that far-fetched. We think about how many, say, musicians, artists, performers, and even just everyday people are making videos, doing performances, making masks, all of these things, and not necessarily just to sell them. People are contributing to society because it's a natural human desire, emotion, compulsion to contribute to the community. And so that's sort of the center of Morris's vision of an agrarian socialist paradise. So that's actually most of the novel, I'd say. A little more than half is just this sort of conversation of, here's how you build an agrarian socialist paradise according to William Morris. But then they, Guest and Dick, basically take off down the river because they're going to go do some farm labor, which Dick is really sort of gung-ho about. Like, yeah, we got to go get this wheat in. It's going to be awesome, kind of thing. But they have a sort of leisurely boat ride up the Thames, and they meet this old guy who's pretty curmudgeonly. And he's like, oh, back in the old days, things were better. I mean, you could exploit people's labor and build terrible polluting factories and things like this. And Guest, who actually is from the Victorian period and knows firsthand about the exploitation of workers and the horrible social conditions and things like this, tends not to agree. But he has this daughter, the old man has this daughter named Ellen, whom, sorry, my cat just knocked a laser pointer off the table. So he has this daughter named Ellen who she is this sort of ideal agrarian socialist paradise woman. She's physically fit, she is intellectually engaged, she's physically attractive, but she's also, like, she can row the boat up the river, she can do farm work, she can hold a conversation about various topics, and so in this way, she's very much the opposite of the two sort of major, maybe three major types of women that Morris knows from his own Victorian world. Because you've either got the aristocratic women who maybe can hold a conversation about things, but they couldn't do any sort of physical labor. Or you've got the industrial workers and the farm workers who are physically strong and capable of doing work, but their intellectual capacities have not been developed in any way. They've, in many cases, virtually no education, and they tend to be old, grizzled, worn down before their time. And so Ellen, who's much older than Guest would have imagined she is, remains youthful, remains physically strong, remains resilient, and so on and so on. And so we get that sort of utopian component here. And so again, this is William Morris's fantasy of an ideal future for England.